Reading is from the Gospel of John, chapter 18. Then the religious leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they didn't enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he weren't a criminal," they replied, "we wouldn't have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they said. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death that he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom isn't of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the religious leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it's your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" Pilate asks a question that's on our lips today and has been for thousands of years as philosophers and thinkers in all cultures have asked this question: what exactly is truth? And boy, do we know it's not just an ancient, esoteric kind of question today. It's highly relevant. Wherever we look, there is talk of alternative truth, about people only telling half the truth, maybe getting away with telling mistruths. We call it today misremembering things when we tell lies. And wherever we look, the lack of truth and truthfulness eventually undermines trust. And we see that all around us today. Trust undermined in our political institutions, trust undermined in so many leaders in different areas of life, because we don't know what's true and what's not true. It's not just public life. In family life, so many people find that they can't trust even their nearest and dearest. Not because of selfishness necessarily, but out of experience. So many people say the only person I can trust is myself and my own truth. And of course, in the workplace, truth and truthfulness is one of the biggest issues here today. There are pressures to perform, to meet targets that mean that everyone is in competition with everyone else. You might say that one of the major sources of human misery today is the absence of truth and truthfulness and trustworthiness wherever we look in our world. And of course, that's what was going on with Pilate here as well in the narrative that we read today. For him, it wasn't just a theoretical question, it was also a very real one. Who could he believe? We may think that our world is in a mess over truth and truthfulness and trustworthiness, but actually not much has changed. Herod the Great, one of his predecessors in ruling Palestine as it was at the time of Pilate before the Romans stepped in, Herod the Great had an extensive family, none of whom felt they could trust him. He said he loved them all, but actually he systematically had them killed one after another, even his closest relatives, even at one point the very people who were going to succeed him in ruling the land. And Pilate and the Romans more generally inherited this lack of trust. There was so much suspicion in the culture that Pilate himself spent most of his time living on the coast in Caesarea, well away from the centre of things in Jerusalem, simply because you didn't know who was telling the truth and who you could trust. Could Romans trust the Jews? Could Jews trust the Romans? I mean, no wonder that's where Pilate intuitively goes in thinking about who Jesus might be. One of the reasons I read from John's account of this story today is because truth is a major theme in the whole of the fourth gospel. It's hardly mentioned in the others, interestingly, but there are some very distinctive things about it in John's gospel. It emerges first of all in chapter 1, where truth is revealed in the glory of Jesus just being here. He's said to be full of grace and truth. And then in chapter 3, the disciples are described as people who do the truth. Chapter 4, truth is something to be discovered and expressed in worship. Worship in spirit and in truth, Jesus talks about. In chapter 8, the truth, which is discovered by following Jesus, will bring personal freedom. The truth will set you free, Jesus says. Then in chapter 14, Jesus famously says, I am the truth. And then in chapter 16, the experience of the Spirit is said to lead disciples into the truth. There's much more that could be said about this theme in John's Gospel, but this isn't the place for it. But the distinctive thing I want to point out here today is that truth in John's Gospel is overwhelmingly an experience. Truth is not so much about information or abstract knowledge. Truth is embodied in relationships, and in particular in relationships with Jesus. So when Pilate asks that question, what is truth? The answer is actually standing before him. Of course, Pilate hides behind the question as a way of avoiding the reality of what he's doing. And if we read the other Gospels, Matthew fills in a detail that John doesn't include, that Pilate tries to avoid making any kind of response to the truth in Jesus by washing his hands and saying, okay, I don't know what the truth is, but it's not my problem. I guess when we talk about truth in terms of facts or information, which is typically how we think of it, we invite discussion. Actually, quite often it leads to argument, not just discussion. Is my truth as true as your truth? And nowhere is like social media in the 21st century for engendering those kinds of somewhat pointless arguments, and certainly acrimonious conversations. But when truth is presented as something embodied in a person, we're invited not to argue, but to respond. We can either wash our hands and say, I don't need to deal with this, or we can engage in what could be a painful process. You may remember in the days following the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, Desmond Tutu was commissioned with picking up the pieces in his Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he was concerned and committed and convinced to think that truth and reconciliation go hand in hand with one another, and that they emerge not out of arguing about facts, but out of personal encounter. Pilate was faced with that personal encounter. He thought he could avoid making a response by washing his hands. But that act, along with the act of not knowing how to make his mind up about anything, it wasn't an avoidance, that was his response. He said he wasn't ready to engage with the ultimate issues of life, death, and personal meaning. No one ever pretended that it would be easy or painless. But I think that's the reality that we're all invited to engage with here today. What exactly is truth? Who is truth? Who can we trust in a world where so many people seem bent on arguing, misremembering, and simply not being trustworthy? Today is Maundy Thursday, the first day of the great Paschal Triduum, when Holy Week devotions focus on Jesus' Last Supper with the disciples and the inauguration of the Christian Eucharist. There are two enacted parables here in these narratives from John and Matthew. On the one hand is what Pilate did with water, and on the other hand is what Jesus did with bread and wine. One was destructive, and the other empowering. I think the challenge for us today is to ask, whose side are we on? Where do we sit in this narrative? And what difference does it all make? Thanks for joining me. God bless you. And I'll be back tomorrow with more reflections on the Passion narratives.